Bridges Between Life and Death. Book review by Antti Savanainen. Iris Paxino, Bridges Between Life and Death. Floris Books. 2021. Introduction. Iris Paxino, born in 1970, is a psychologist and therapist whose PhD dissertation was about near-death experiences. Her practice resides in Stuttgart, Germany. Paxino's interest in the riddles of death started at the age of 18 when her recently deceased grandmother started to appear in her dreams. Paxino was convinced that the encounter was real. Although it took place in a dream state, she started looking for information on how to gain conscious experience from the world of the death. The answer provided by science was a disappointment. The axiom of science was that there is absolutely nothing beyond death since the brain produces consciousness. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy provided her with a completely different perspective on death than science and offered a modern meditative path for developing clairvoyant abilities. Paxino started later working as a psychologist with dying patients. She noticed that the patients needed help not only with unresolved personal matters and how to face death, but also after they had crossed the threshold between this and the invisible world. I present some Paxino's experiences and observations on deceased people in various afterlife stages. It is fascinating that a contemporary anthroposophist can share her empirical insights into life between death and rebirth. Of course, any evaluation must be based on some framework. For me, this framework is Theosophy, especially teachings of Mr. Pekka Ervast, who was a pioneer of the Finnish Theosophical movement. Transition to the etheric realm. The moment of natural death has a sacred character. The person leaves her physical body and makes the transition to the etheric world. This usually happens via the head, but it can sometimes happen also via the heart. The etheric or life body is the bearer of memory. The deceased has lucid consciousness in her etheric veil. She is surrounded by light and sees the panoramic life review. The person's guardian angel becomes visible. Also, other angelic beings are present. They see the eternal self of the person and the entire sequence of incarnations of this human being. In addition, deceased relatives and the loved ones appear and greet her with loving gentleness. Unfortunately, the transition to the next world is not always beautiful and harmonious. The transition may be complicated by fear, which dims the light of the soul and consequently the ability to observe the spiritual world. Moreover, the materialistic denial of the afterlife may act as a hindrance. Paxino mentions that painkillers and mind-altering drugs can also result in a dulled state of consciousness immediately after death. The way a person dies has a great impact on what happens immediately after death. Some people, who are victims of a sudden accident or violent death, don't realize that they are dead. These people can be helped with a focused prayer. The Lord's Prayer is one of the most effective. The prayer makes it possible to transmit peace and warmth of the soul, which help the deceased to notice the helpers and move on to a brighter realm. However, it's also possible that the person continues living in her etheric veil and stays in the vicinity of the place where the accident or homicide took place. Consequently, this has a negative effect on the aura of the place, which can make the scene more prone to accidents. In addition, the person can continuously relive the tragic events leading to her death. This state can be understood as a post-mortem stress disorder. The deceased can be trapped in the etheric world if she has had a strong materialistic worldview or has died of a substance overdose. Again, the person might not realize that she is dead. The deceased addict will instinctively seek for the company of the living who share the same addiction and will encourage their abuse of alcohol or drugs. The addiction doesn't suddenly disappear in the etheric world, and neither does it so in the following state in the lower soul world. Interestingly, Paxino mentions that chemotherapy used to treat cancer has a hardening effect on the etheric body, and thus substantially increases the time spent in the etheric world. Paxino makes it clear that this should not be used as an excuse to refuse chemotherapy. Paxino notes that religious people can be trapped in the etheric world for a period of time. This is because many people in the Reformed circles have been taught in churches that death is a state of sleep, and that they will be woken up in the judgment day. This incorrect belief is reinforced by the common saying, "Rest in peace." Perhaps surprisingly, also dogmatic theosophists, esotericists and anthroposophists can be trapped, but for a different reason. Dogmatic esoteric views have hardened the etheric body, which slows down its dissolving process in the etheric realm. There are many similarities between Paxino's and Ervast's description of the first stages of the afterlife. For instance, Also, Urvest talks about incessantly repeated reliving of traumatic events leading to death in the context of violent death and suicides. Furthermore, he also describes how the deceased with a serious addiction seek for the company of the living in their desperate search for satisfaction. On the other hand, Urvest doesn't mention the afterlife effects of painkillers or chemotherapy, which was not available at all in Urvest's time. According to Urvest, the life review takes place in the light of higher self, which makes it an objective evaluation of thoughts, emotions, and deeds. An angel can be present in the moment of death to sever the silver cord connecting the physical and etheric bodies. However, Urvest doesn't talk about the personal guardian angel in this context. Instead, in his view, the role of guardian angels is to protect children. Helping the dead. Paxino divides the deceased needing help into 3 categories: suicides, violent deaths, and black magic. The last category is rarely mentioned in theosophical writings in the context of death. It includes people who have worked in concentration camps or in violent criminal organizations. These people are not automatically freed from the grip of evil in afterlife. Instead, they need help which can be provided only by certain beings in Devachan, or by living people whose innermost self has been fortified by the being of Christ. It's possible to help a suicide by loving her without judgment and forgiving her. This makes it easier for her to forgive herself and receive the help offered by the spiritual world. At the same time, it's very important that the suicide takes the responsibility for her deed, along with compassion. A firm approach is needed to protect the relatives from too high a burden resulting from the influence of the suicide. A murderer sees the tragic consequences of her actions in the life review, which fills her with horror. This results to self-judgment and believing that one is not worthy of forgiveness. Sometimes the person crossing the threshold is both the victim and perpetrator at the same time. Paxino describes this kind of case in which the deceased lived in an environment akin to a suicide. She managed to convince the deceased that the dark imprisonment is not eternal. The situation had a beautiful closure. Quote begins, "It was then also possible to meet the being of Christ, who was shining in the background. It was profoundly moving to see how this young man, who had been in agony between the worlds for years, sank to his knees and let the unconditional love of Christ flow into him. Now he was ready to forgive himself and his murderer." Quote ends. It's interesting to compare this scene with that of Urvest's presentation on the remorseful suicide. Quote begins, "Led by his helper, he arrives at the feet of the Lord of life and death. The Christ raises his lachrymose eyes towards the shining being and confesses, 'Oh, how I have been so mistaken about the great purpose of life. What is going to happen to me? How can I ever atone for what I have done? Is there any mercy for me?' And then utter, 'Now love, infinite grace, and mercy radiate from the eyes of that bright and shining being. I do understand you, my child, and I forgive you. Rise and start the work, and do not sin any more." Quote ends. According to Paxino, the person who has greatly suffered has initially no strength to move on from the etheric world to the soul world. She is first guided to the place of healing. This healing work is done by the deceased residing in the upper soul world in Devachan, and it's supervised by high angelic beings. Discussion. In my opinion, Paxino's description of the afterlife concurs well with those of Steiner's and Urvest. Perhaps one can say that she is closer to Urvest than Steiner, whose teachings in this regard tend to be a bit abstract. One might of course question the validity of Paxino's book. Perhaps she has just skillfully compiled the book from other sources with no real supersensible knowledge. My answer is an emphatic no. In my opinion, there is a strong element of authenticity in her work, and she speaks of aspect of the afterlife rarely seen in other sources that I'm aware of. However, this doesn't mean that she would be infallible. It is worth mentioning that not all share the same view than I do. An anthroposophical critic strongly felt that Paxino's book contradicts Steiner's teachings. It seems to me that the crux of this kind of criticism stems from the fact that Paxino writes about the perspectives of afterlife not addressed by Steiner, e.g., quite common trapping in the etheric world for substantially longer time than 3 days. In the end of the book, there are meditation exercises which develop the ability in the living to help the deceased in a conscious way. One might add another perspective to this helping work from Urvest. Quote begins. People with good hearts and whose minds are not chained by bigoted doctrines, who are full of a will to help and who help and serve living people on this earth, console and do good to others, can learn to help the dead while they are asleep. When in sleep, with no memory or knowledge of it, they leave the physical body in their astral bodies. And because they are humans who want to serve and help, they are accepted into a school. They are taught what they should do and in what way to help. Quote ends. The central theme in Paxino's important book is that the connection between the living and the dead is both possible and important. The essential element in this connection is an open and loving heart. Paxino's perspective is deeply ethical. She sees all people, the good and bad alike, valuable human beings worthy of forgiveness, help, and compassion. I dare to say that Paxino's book provides new insights on what happens after we die, even to people familiar with the esoteric literature in this domain. Although Paxino's book is not an easy read as it addresses quite dark aspects of the afterlife, I think that her book has potential to also reach people outside the anthroposophical and theosophical circles.